Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Janai and this is Karmic Fixer Tarot. I just wanted to do a reading on something that's been on my mind lately. Let's see, I'm working from a little bit of a script because I've noticed that I do have a tendency to rant a bit. I was editing a video that I haven't posted yet, and I was a little taken aback by how long it took me to get to the actual reading. It was close to about 20 minutes. So I don't know if I'm actually even going to post that or at least put in some timestamps, just in case you want to skip the preamble and get right to the reading. So I'm going to try a little different. I'm going to try and be a little more scripted, help me stay on task, at least for the portion before I get to the actual reading. And then, I'll just go where spirit leads me. But I have had something on my mind a lot lately. I've been reflecting on the state of the US and the much talked about polarization of Americans against each other. I think this is a polarization that's only intensified under Trumpism and the current regime. Now, in a bit of frankness, I've been struggling with more, I hate to say it, more kind of hatred in my heart than I've ever felt in my entire life. And it actually frightens me a lot. I think this is a sort of spiritual battle that has befallen the US over the past decade at least, even though I think it goes back even further than that. Personally, I think it goes back to the rise of right wing media. I know that might seem a bit of a hot take or like it's a pejorative against conservatives and Republicans and, anyone with that mindset. But I call it out because within the conservative talk spaces, there are always kind of seeds of polarization, I think. The discourse is always painted the other side of the aisle as being uniquely evil or demonic. And kind of advocating, when you think about the things that people were advocating for, things like reproductive rights, that sort of discourse would paint women who are in favor of, say, abortion or abortion rights as being baby killers. There's always this kind of rhetoric. Say people in the LGBT community were trying to shove their lifestyle down people's throats. Black people who called out racial inequality or police brutality were always playing the race card. Feminists or anyone who's a vocal advocate of women's rights is always being painted as a sort of ball buster or a male basher. Things like that. This was kind of a discourse that I call out because personally I grew up listening to it at the behest of my mother. My mother was a conservative lady, conservative woman. I love my mother dearly, but she's definitely a conservative. And of course, there's always separate discourse regarding Black conservative people. Now, my mother, I guess I am kind of ranting again. She voted for Trump twice. She wasn't here; she passed on before she was able to vote for him again. But I grew up listening to this sort of right wing, echo chamber, this sort of rhetoric. Um, Voices of people like Sean Hannity, or if you grew up in the Atlanta area, people like Neil Bortz, or all sorts of these kind of right wing voices. You know, these are the people she was listening to every day, and by proxy, I was listening to them. And this is kind of the rhetoric that I'd heard. So I can remember a time where it just seemed a bit of a kind of, it seemed like the rhetoric from that side was always very sort of deeply antagonistic. But I digress a little bit. I bring that up because I do believe that the right wing media was kind of the shot across the bow against anyone who disagreed with their policies or stances. Very specifically, the Democratic Party rather, they always seem to save their barbs very, very pointedly for Democrats. Seemed like they're arch rivals in a lot of cases. I think this was the impetus of their rage against people like Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, or as you would often hear in these spaces, like it's a pejorative, they would call him Barack Hussein Obama. Or in my mother's case, she would call him Barack Hussein Insane Obama. This just sort of rage that was always, you know, right at the tip of their tongues. And this rage, of course, I think backlashed into the rise of Donald Trump. And now there's been a reactionary sort of rage from the left and from liberals, or more so the left. I don't think liberals are angry enough at what's going on, but there's been kind of the left has reacted, I think, and there's been this activation of a reactionary rage that I think is an equal measure to what we've been receiving from the right. There's been a bit of a mass exodus from MAGA taking place thanks to Trump's measures and policies and whatnot, destroying their lives as well. But, you know, even people trying to break away from MAGA, they've been met with contempt by non MAGA people, left leaning Americans. And there's just kind of been this breakdown, this sort of estrangement of families, um, this unwillingness of people to cross the political aisle as far as dating goes, for example, marriages dissolving, friendships kind of fracturing. The online discourse has been getting harder and just, it's been getting a lot more hateful. And not just online, but there's just kind of this deep feeling, this ambient sort of just hatred that, Americans have been having for each other for growing for the past decade, it feels like. And, just kind of thinking about it and just sort of feeling it personally, unfortunately, walking around with this kind of hatred for my fellow American, it's really just sort of grating. It's something that doesn't feel good to not trust your fellow American. I mean, this isn't necessarily new, but it feels like it's intensified over the years. There's still that part of me that watches the FAFO content, even though, it's not really even funny anymore. I think it started out as kind of a Schadenfreude sort of thing, but it's not funny to watch even these MAGA people going through things based on how they voted. Sometimes, I see, discourse online of young people, particularly young men who might still espouse Trump support or who are bemoaning their state of affairs since voting for Trump, or even being more misogynistic, and just kind of not being able to muster sympathy or empathy just because of who I think they voted for. So I think that's been a real kind of problem, I think. And it's something that bothers me to engage in or to feel in my heart. So I think that's what this reading is going to be about. I think I'm going to be asking spirit how to release these sorts of feelings, how to let go of anger, disappointment, or I dare say even hatred. And I hope this is a reading that'll resonate with you. It's something that's been on my heart for a long time. And yeah, if this is something that you're interested in, please stick around and I will begin my reading shortly. Alrighty, so I'll start the reading rather. Oh, I've been trying to do these videos. I really think my medium as far as communicating is writing. So if you want to see me in, I guess, a more natural medium, I do have a Substack. It's also called Karmic Fixer Tarot, where what I'll do is I do these readings in real time, and I reflect on the readings, maybe for like a week or so or a few days before I do a write up. And I tend to put that write up on Substack, but I put my in real time readings up on YouTube. And if you found them, I appreciate you watching them. Let me know what you think in the comments. Honestly, let me know if you find them engaging, or based on what I see, I can tell that this is still a new channel, so it doesn't necessarily get a whole bunch of engagement yet. So I guess I'm still finding my footing. When anybody finds this, if anybody finds this, I'm just kind of growing as a content creator. Tarot is my main thing, and I do love learning about tarot, and I like writing about it. I really like pulling the cards and, seeing what spirit has to say, and it just feels like a surprise with every pull. So I'm drawn to tarot itself, and it's something that I would like to do, providing readings for people, things like that. But I guess I feel like being on the internet is a good place to start, just to kind of maybe build the confidence to do readings, perhaps even build a little bit of a following or community or whatnot. So all of this is in its infancy, so I'm still learning. So I appreciate any comments you might leave. If you like the video, give it a like. If you don't like the video, it's okay too. Um, whatever viewership comes along on this video, I'll take it. Mostly it's just for the love of the tarot. So yeah, so I'm doing a little bit of a shuffle here. I'm working with my Thoth deck. I haven't used this deck in a while, but I figured maybe the Thoth might give some very sort of frank, very I don't know. I feel like the Thoth deck is kind of and correct me if I'm wrong, if you're a tarot enthusiast, the Thoth deck kind of feels like more of a kind of a shadowy deck, or a deck that really kind of cuts deep to, your inner self. Might be a good deck for working with your shadow side. And today I'm working with my shadow side. I'm trying to figure out how to release hate, how to become more trusting of my fellow American. Because I think in this time that we're living in, we need to be able to trust each other. We don't necessarily have to, kumbaya or be lovey-dovey, but we have to find a way to release our uncharitable thinking about each other. We've got to a place where, you know, different communities of people feel like other communities actively hate them, and we are kind of very polarized against each other. But as I've been growing more class conscious and more interested in that, I do kind of feel like it's a diversion for, you know, ethnicities, gender, religion, all the other ways that we divide ourselves. It feels like a diversion against what we should really be resisting against, and that is our governmental system. It's the 1%, the oligarchy. We have so much working against us that we do need to find a way to connect to each other more, and to be less polarized amongst ourselves, less polarized amongst working class or middle class people. But I think that's a whole other subject. So I'm going to, again, I feel like I'm ranting some more, and I really do want to curtail that. I'd like to make these videos as engaging as possible. And, if you're a tarot enthusiast, you maybe just want to get straight to the reading and not be ranted at. If you're somebody who doesn't mind the rants, I appreciate that. But yeah, so my query to Spirit again, and I wrote it down, just to help me remember and stay clear. Spirit, how do I release hatred to become a better person, a better American? How do I release any hatred or ill feelings or distrust that I have for my fellow Americans? How do I release any hard feelings that I have for my fellow Americans in order to be a more loving, giving, charitable, empathetic U.S. citizen? What do I need to know about not allowing the polarization? So I did a little bit of shuffle. I'm going to do a little bit of a cut here. Okay, so we've cut the cards. All right, so I'm going to pull this card. Second. I panned down, but I think I have my desk and my laptop and everything configured the way I need it to. Let's see. It's all still very much a work in progress. Okay, so I've pulled 3 cards. So I think what I'll do will be an advice from the universe sort of spread. It's like my favorite spread. It's a simple 3-card spread. I tend to not necessarily do elaborate spreads, even though I am working more on learning things like Celtic Cross. There's a 5-card horseshoe spread. There's a card of you spread that I like also. But for these YouTubes, I think I like to keep it at 3 cards. And as a reader, I don't necessarily like to pull a bunch of clarifiers. For me, anyway, and obviously I can't speak for every other reader, but for me, I feel like the more cards I pull, sometimes the muddier the response can get. So I think at the very least, the way that my intuition works, or the way that I can pull information and interpret the cards, keep it concise, which is actually pretty different, I guess, from my speaking style because, again, I'm given to ranting, but spirit doesn't rant to me. The cards come out. Usually, I can find an interpretation that's really insightful, and it doesn't necessarily take a whole lot of cards. Again, I can only speak for myself. So we're doing the 3 card spread, and let's see. The first card that I will pull will be what I need to know, just sort of some ground level information about either the query, the thing that I'm querying about. So just sort of some base level knowledge. And so the first card of the Princess of Cups. Now the Princess of Cups in the Thoth deck, I think is analogous to the Page of Cups in your mainstream tarot, or specifically the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot. So we've got our Princess of Cups, and I think this is very close to the Page energy, and that's just sort of an earnestness. The Page slash Princess represents I think when it's in whichever element that it's in, it represents kind of the essence, I think, of that particular element. Just kind of a youthful energy, an earnest sort of energy, an openness to whatever energy that specific suit is. So I think this Princess of Cups energy is a youthful, I dare say, if not immature, perhaps, energy. And cups represents emotions, love, relationships, the way we feel about things, the way that we receive emotions, um, the way that we express our emotions, anything relational, whether that's love, platonic care, perhaps even hatred. So I think this is a very sort of young, maybe an energy that is learning how to regulate itself. So I think this card can represent how maybe dysregulated we're feeling as Americans right now. We have a lot of things going against us, unfortunately. And these things that are going against us probably, or not probably, generally inform the way that we do anything. And I think it genuinely informs the way that we vote, or the mindset that we have about each other. In my intro, I mentioned things like media kind of feeding into how we view ourselves and how we view others around us, how we view people as opponents. Maybe there's this feeling, not necessarily based on anything aside from how we feel, or how we respond to other people's words, behaviors, etc. We base our feelings on what we see, whether that's truthful, whether we have a way of processing what we see, rationally. You know, I mentioned the right wing ecosystem growing up. I think a lot of people, perhaps who might be on the right, would say that the right wing ecosystem, right wing media, is a response to mainstream media. But in a lot of ways, it felt like that particular media, right wing media, was very sort of, there was a certain edge to it that seemed way more personal, way more aggrieved. And, it's very easy, if you listen to that media exclusively, it's very easy to believe that your political opponents or anybody who thinks differently to you is an existential danger to you. And again, like I mentioned, I grew up listening to this by way of my mother. And it's amazing how media will kind of just insinuate itself into you, and you can adopt what the media is saying to you. And at this point, it's not just limited to right wing media. There's now kind of very left leaning media, and it's very easy to absorb, you know, absorb the images and the rhetoric that comes from that. And it can all be very polarizing and rage baity, and it's it's almost like it's designed to make us more emotional, to heighten our emotion, because it feeds engagement. If you're constantly enraged at what the other side is doing, feeling that the other side is an existential threat to you, can make you afraid. It can make you angry. It can make you distrusting. And I think that that's what the Princess of Cups might be representing. Just sort of this emotional energy that needs regulating, but we're not quite in the space of how to do that yet. So this is a what you need to know card, first card of the spread. So let's look at card number two. The card number two represents a new perspective. So let's see what we have here. We have Queen of Swords. Now the sword suit represents mindset, represents communication, represents a mastery of those sorts of things, I think. Um, maybe mastery of how to receive certain things, how to adjust your mindset, how to um, master your communication in a way that can be beneficial. I think maybe part of how we, I think maybe part of how we can get out of this sort of loop of just kind of, polarization is I think we have to develop a sort of mastery of how we take in information, how we communicate with each other. And if we look at the Queen, and we're in context, so the Queen of Swords energy, I think this is an energy, again, of mastery of communication and of how we receive information. And it's finding a way to not allow these sorts of things to be weaponized. And that might be easier said than done. Um, I think it connotes a certain goodwill that we ought to have. If we, pay attention to our media, I think what this card represents also can be developing a discernment for what we are consuming media wise, a discernment for our diet. And that might be more key than it's ever occurred to me anyway, into how we're feeling about our fellow Americans. One thing that I had noticed is that, I guess just a little bit of backstory. I don't want to necessarily get too deep into it because I don't want this video to be exhaustingly long. But I'd reached a point where, I was living with my mother and, we would travel together here and there. And in her home, of course, she listens to what she wants to listen to. Um, again, right wing media, um, televangelists. It's interesting how right wing media and evangelicalism seem to be hand in glove at this point. But there was a lot of that in the home. But one thing that was very exclusive to, her car radio was right wing media. And, we would drive around together and things like that. And she would like to have it on, you know, the right wing spaces. And, I'd listen to go along with that. And, you know, one day her car broke down and, she reached a point where she didn't want it fixed. She didn't necessarily, was not really eager to get it fixed and to be a motorist again. She was getting up in age. And being away from that kind of media for any length of time, it's amazing how when you're not taking in sorts of, if you're, when you're not taking in a certain type of media, it's almost like the spell that it has over you breaks. I think there was a documentary on about a journalist and their father, I think, was very into Fox News and whatnot. And one of the keys to, I think, I guess, deprogramming this person was to restrict their access to that media, cut off that particular media source. I guess I didn't have to do these anecdotes to get to the point of cutting off access to certain ecosystems. And it doesn't just have to be right wing. Sometimes if you're listening to, if you're in the left wing echo chamber, that might not necessarily be as conducive because that certainly doesn't give anybody any sort of grace example for I'll just say it, any grace for MAGA, things like that. And just kind of hearing that over and over again. Being in these siloed off media ecosystems, it really, that feeds into polarization. A lot of media feeds into that. If you think back to 2016, the Russian misinformation, what was it, Cambridge Analytica, the scandal of, I guess, Russian bots, Russian misinformation infiltrating Facebook, for example. Things where the media can be weaponized to polarize people. I mean, I guess there's so much discourse on this that I don't know if I could do justice here. Just kind of hitting on that, and I guess that could relate to the Queen of Swords. Finding a way to be more discerning, being more mindful of the media we're taking in, how it's making us feel. I think that really kind of gets to the heart of the Queen here. How does what we're taking in make us feel? Are we feeling like there's just one group of people, there's no nuance to them at all, and they are just, one way, irredeemable, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on? Especially here in the US, where we have a binary um, political system, which at this point is completely broken. It's very easy to be us versus them, and quite literally a polarization. So I think this queen, as far as a new perspective, suggests that we are more introspective about what we're taking in. How's it making us feel? Is it making us less charitable toward our fellow Americans? Is it making us less forgiving of them? Is it really hardening our hearts to our fellow Americans? There's a lot of justification for why we can't forgive ex-MAGA, or why um, leftists are don't love America enough. There's all sorts of that polarized, those those mindsets, and people make all sorts of justifications for them. But if we want to think about the bigger picture and what it'll take for us to become an actual nation, a place where people can have a future, a place where people, even if you don't, you know, even if you're not having dinner with somebody who's, you know, ideologically or politically, you know, opposite to what you believe, even if you're not necessarily coming together and being friends or whatnot, at least finding a way to let go of limiting beliefs toward those people, letting go of things that letting go of beliefs that cast them in a dangerous light. So I think, minding the media that we take in might be a good start, might be a good place to really start examining where we are. Are we hearing, is the media that we're taking in, is it coming to us in good faith? Think about the sources that are putting out the media. Is it for genuine information? Is it a news source, or is it a sort of is it rage bait? A lot of times when we're in our ecosystems, we have to be careful. Are we looking for information, or are we looking for affirmation? Are we looking for news or confirmation bias? And I think this card represents being more discerning on how we're consuming media, what media we're consuming. And yeah, I think the Queen represents that. Okay, so my third card is going to be an action step card. This is a card that I think can give us practical advice on maybe what to do to carry ourselves over into a new perspective, um, an action step that can open us up towards an outcome that we're hoping for. So this will be the Two of Swords. And my particular deck of Thoth Tarot still has the keywords. And the keyword here is peace. And since this is the Swords card, the card of mindset, communication, I think and this might seem kind of pat to you, but I think it's pretty profound. I think we need to be willing to be more charitable to each other. And this might actually be easier said than done. And it's something that I'm working on. As satisfying as it is to, keep our distance from, say, somebody who voted MAGA. I, in case it's news to anybody who's watching this, I'm a progressive, so you know, I I'm heavily critical of MAGA, and if that's, I hope that's not offensive to you, but if it is, you know, it's not my intent to cause offense, but I have to speak, my opinion and how I feel, especially on, I guess, my channel. But anyway, I'd like to assume if you are here, though, maybe you're a more progressive side, or at the very least, you're open. And one thing that I'm having to learn personally is it's a choice how you view, the world around you, the people around you. And it might be worth more to us to have a charitable view of our fellow Americans than it is to keep a hard heart toward them. I'm not saying, again, you have to invite everybody into your home or you have to be friends with everybody, but maybe find a way to give the benefit of the doubt where you can. And I think that's what this card represents. And this seems pretty straightforward. And again, it's our feelings are still raw, as we look at the state of the world, particularly the US, how things have deteriorated so much since our current president um, regained the presidency. And it's very easy to be angry with all the people, all the institutions, and whatnot that enabled him to return to power. And we have to find a way to release this. And I think this card represents making the choice to. It won't magically happen. I think swords are, when I think of action and passion, I tend to think of the wands, but I think that can also apply to the swords. I think sometimes you have to do something before you're ready to do something in a lot of ways. Um, you kind of have to make a choice that this is the thing that you're going to do. And I think, as pat as this might sound, as simplistic as it might sound, the best way to release hatred from your heart, release it from your mindset, to free yourself from it, is to just do it. Is to just make the steps, make the decision that it is worth doing and that you should do it. And I think that's kind of the hardest part, deciding if it's worth releasing how we feel about maybe a certain group of people, a certain demographic, a certain, if it's worth it to not hate. And I think sometimes people view having a hard opinion of others, having a hard opinion of, say, people who voted against their human rights as a safety precaution. And, I can relate to that. You feel like, you have to keep your guard up against these people because they haven't shown that they're safe. They voted against their own best interests just to spite you, it feels like. If we look at MAGA, maybe we feel like they voted against Kamala Harris, for, the most obvious reason, it seems like, because she's a half black woman, half black, half Indian woman who I think I can't say if she predominantly identifies as black or whatnot, but she's, by all, for all practical purposes, a black woman in America who ran for president, who people just, there's that feeling that that was the main reason why people didn't vote for her. People have all sorts of reasons that they'll give, but there's that feeling that so much of the American demographic focused on her ethnicity and her gender. And when you think of it that way, it can feel like, and I guess I can speak as a black woman on that, it feels like there's this whole world, this whole population of people against you. And sometimes it can feel safer. And this doesn't necessarily just apply to black women, but speaking as a black woman, this is my particular experience. It can feel like we have to keep this guard up. Sometimes even it feels like holding aught in your heart for that person, for a group of people, or for what a group of people represents. It's like almost like a security blanket. It's like I can't allow myself to get taken in by these people who are a threat to me, an existential threat to me. And I think there are better ways of protecting and disengaging from, populations or from a society that doesn't seem to have one's best interest at heart. Um, and it doesn't include, you know, it doesn't include hatred. Hatred hurts. I mean, I can speak from, again, personal experience. When I watch things that are rage baiting, when I watch things that make me feel anger for a certain population, a certain demographic, a certain group of people, I find it physically uncomfortable. I guess, again, I'm an empathetic person. I'm an empath, I think. And I find it physically uncomfortable to have those feelings about people. And, sometimes I'm tempted to hold on to those feelings because maybe it feels like it protects me from trusting people who have proven to be untrustworthy through their vote and through their rhetoric and through who they chose to support. But can't rely on something as corrosive as hate to protect us or to keep us separate. Um, so I think this card represents choosing peace. And peace isn't passive. Peace isn't, holding hands, fahu forays, like, it's not passive. And even though it might seem perfunctory or it might seem performative, peace, I think, it can be a choice as far as, oh, sorry, I had to step away from my computer for a moment. But yeah, peace. So I think about peace and I also think about forgiveness. One thing that came to mind, I guess, just as I was thinking about this card, reminds me of something that I saw. I think I was watching Beyonce and Jay Z's On the Run concert. I think it was on HBO or whatnot, and I was watching it. And there was a portion of her show where Beyonce gives a quote um, where it talks about forgiveness as being waiving the right to hurt you because you hurt me. And I think that might be what this card represents. And I think that can represent forgiveness and peace. And it's not passive, it's an active step where it's a choice to disengage from the things that foster hatred. Um, it can be very difficult to walk away from, it can be hard to step back. I guess, Christ consciousness, turning the other cheek. A lot of people feel like that is, weak. It's stepping away from a fight or, backing down when maybe you shouldn't back down. Like if you listen to a lot of MAGA, I think they genuinely believe that Jesus is too woke. And that's kind of a whole other situation. But the idea of stepping away from something that's not worth engaging in, even if it's something that your pride is telling you to engage in, somebody wants to be aggressive to you, somebody is really trying to get in your face and drag you into the mud with them. Your ego and your pride will tell you to give this person the business. But maybe that's not the thing to do. I mean, I can't speak for, I guess it depends on the situation. But, choosing peace over engaging with war, I dare say. And, the idea of war is happening right now. If, at the time of recording this, the US and Israel war against Iran is still raging on, a war that didn't have to be, is right now. And things like war engage because people feel like they have to engage. You cannot back down because you don't want to be seen as weak. I think this action card, the Two of Swords, is an invitation to think about strength in a different way. Maybe it takes a certain strength to not engage with something that is futile, not engage with something that will cause more harm. Um, and that's a choice to make. Um, make that choice on, I dare say, start at on a smaller scale. when it comes to how one regards people who vote differently to you, people of a different political party, a different religion, a different ideology altogether. An ideology, in fact, that unfortunately might be harmful to you, might be harmful to your access to certain things, your human rights and your dignity. Obviously, the impulse is to defend yourself by hook or by crook, but maybe there's a different way to defend yourself or protect yourself that doesn't require getting into the muck with ignorance or with hateful people. And this might be something to consider, um, that might actually look different for different people. So I think the action step is finding a way to choose peace, however that looks to you. So I think that's an interesting card. And this was the advice from the universe spread that I pulled. And I hope that's resonated with you. And let me know how you feel about that in the comments. And one thing that I'd like to do to close my reading is to pull a bottom of the deck card. Usually, I can find that the bottom of the deck card um, might speak to the underlying energy of the response, maybe the underlying energy of the query itself. Um, just kind of another added insight that I think works as a nice throughput for the spread. So we've had our 3 cards, advice from the universe, and we'll take one more from the bottom. Okay. All right, so what do we have here? We have adjustment. Now, in the Thoth deck, adjustment is analogous to the Justice card in standard Rider-Waite-Smith or just standard tarot. So I think the adjustment / justice major arcana card is a very, very telling card. When you think about hatred, there's of course the injustice to hatred. Hatred is generally born of ignorance, it's born of fear, it's born of grievance, things that you can't hold within yourself if you're somebody who believes in justice, if you're somebody who's genuinely about fairness, equality, equity, then you can find ways to, you don't engage in hatred for its own sake. You don't engage in bigotry. In fact, I guess put a different way, if you're somebody who's justice minded, maybe the only thing you do hate is injustice. And I think that as a society and as individuals, I think we can only start with ourselves. We have to become people who are so wedded to justice that we can't countenance injustice of any kind. And I think maybe there's a lot of us who are still okay with injustice to a certain degree. Maybe we wouldn't admit it to ourselves or to others. Maybe it's something that we can't acknowledge. Maybe there's this feeling that for there to be winners, there have to be losers, or, we can't afford universal health care. How will we pay for all that? Yet we find money to pay for war. But that's a whole other side. And I appreciate how this card is justice, or not justice, rather adjustment in the Thoth deck. And I like the use of the word adjustment because when things are unjust, when the scales are tipped, when the scales are unbalanced, adjustment, it takes balancing those scales. It takes effort. You remove the extra weight from one side to balance out the scales and find a way to make things equal if they're showing up in our society as unequal. And that takes work. Justice is work. Justice, unfortunately, isn't the natural order of the world. If we want to live in a society where all of us have a chance to live our lives, where all of us have a chance at life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's something we have to work toward. And releasing hatred, letting go of hatred, it's an adjustment, I dare say. We have to start by looking inward, examining the parts of us that are okay with countenancing injustice. Are we okay with certain things happening because they're so far removed? Maybe they're on the other side of the world. We don't think about them because we don't think they'll be our problem, and we're okay with it. Or if we see something bad happening to somebody who voted against us or who voted for somebody who is actively seeking to harm, are we okay with that? Because we don't think that it matters because it's not affecting us. I dare say a lot of that sort of being okay with things being unequal, I think that gives rise to a society of people who don't trust each other. And if you don't trust each other, you can't cultivate peace. You can't cultivate love. You can't cultivate a society that works for everybody to the point where you have a society that ultimately works for nobody. And so I think this major arcana card, being the energy beneath or the underlying energy of this particular spread, I think this gives us something to think about. Gives us an opportunity or an invitation to look within ourselves, see where we might be okay with certain injustices. Um, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. A very timely quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Um, it's good in these times to remember the wisdom of people who have fought for justice. And yeah, I think this is something to definitely keep in mind. And this reading was actually pretty insightful for me, so I hope it was insightful for you as well. And I thank you so much for joining me. Let me know what you think in our comment section. I already watched back my intro where I was reading from the script. I don't like looking like, or rather, appearing to read from a script. So that might be something that I tweak. But mostly, I want this to be engaging. I want this to be something that you get some insight from, and maybe the ranting gets in the way of that. Maybe it doesn't. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. If this is your sort of cup of tea, I definitely appreciate a like. And if you'd like to see more of these videos, please consider subscribing. And until I see you next time, take care. Talk to you again.